Welcome to the WealthStack podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Rosic, the director of WealthStack Content and Solutions. In this episode, I'm joined by Adrian Johnstone, CEO of Practifi. Congratulations on the new title, by the way. For context, Practifi is a performance optimization platform for the wealth management industry and made the leap into the U.S. markets in 2017. And the topic for this episode: is the perfect tech stack a unicorn? Does it even exist? But, before we get going, Adrian, I'd love to hear about your background and how Practifi ultimately came to be.
Awesome. Thanks, Shannon. Thank you for the congratulations. It's an exciting time. Look, I'm Australian. You can tell from the accent, and the story of how Practifi came to be kind of feels a little bit typically Australian because it happened over a lunch that spilled into a dinner in a wine bar. So, all of the best ideas come to be at the bottom of the bottle, it seems. But
of course,
my co-founder Glenn and I both worked in the industry from different perspectives. I was a consultant who spent a lot of time helping people with what the future of regulation looked like, where that was going, how they could balance that with client experience and technology to enable it, all those sorts of good things. And Glenn was deep into technology and all things CRM. So we shared too many wines and decided that there must be a business where you could bring wine, client experience, and compliance and technology together. I mean, it seemed an obvious pairing.
Absolutely. Well, next time I go wine tasting, I'll definitely keep that in mind. But I appreciate the background, and I do want to dive into our first segment of Stats All, folks. So let's stay down under a little bit here and stay in Australia, because I want to examine the financial services regulatory climates in Australia versus here in the US. Australia is home to the highest number of regulation technology companies in APAC, and there are more than 80 established reg techs making up close to 65% of the APAC market, which is quite sizable. So what can stateside advisors learn from or prepare for with a look down under, if you will?
Yes, be careful with those looks down under. Look, I think the Australian landscape is an interesting one, and as an Aussie, it's always entertaining to me that you see huge tribes of Australian advisors piling on for study tours. I think they like to call them when they come to the US to see how firms are going. It's a bit of a junket, and there's a little bit of talking to some firms along the way. But of course, I always think that the reverse is better. Because if the US advisors went down to Australia and took a look at the industry, they'd be like, firstly, do I want to stay in this market? And secondly, how do I ensure that the US landscape does not turn into the Australian one? Because the reason there are so many reg techs down there is that the market is just so overregulated. There's so much to learn, and where self-regulation fails and government steps in, how badly that can go. Australia is a little bit of a different industry dynamic, or a little bit of a different market dynamic down there. We have kind of a legislated compulsory retirement savings program that's called superannuation. And kind of think of it as like a 401k program on steroids, but it is basically taking, I think it's currently 10.5% of your earnings for every income earner in Australia, every salaried income earner. And that is the minimum inflows that go into the industry every year. And once they're in, you can't get them out except for in some tight exceptions, till you're 65. So retirement savings is kind of core to the industry. But because that money is tied up for so long, the government kind of tries to get helpful and say, how do we make sure no one's doing bad things? And of course, the lion's share of the industry aren't doing bad things. But for the 2% that choose to, then they go pretty catastrophically bad. And as a result, the government steps in with a big heavy hand and regulates like crazy. So there's so much regulation to watch that without technology, you kind of can't really do it. From a US perspective, I think the key learning there is just don't fall in the same trap. Make self-regulation work. Be better, because the flip side is terrifying.
Well, that's a good perspective to have. And, in a similar vein, I saw a stat that Australia has actually produced 21 of the world's about 920 global tech unicorns. Why has Australia become such a hub for innovation? And, what have you learned from the Australian and US wealth tech markets?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. If you talk to politicians, they've of course generated an environment that fosters innovation. But I prefer to take the lens that you don't go outside in Australia because everything's trying to kill you, so you stay inside and innovate. So when we look at it, I think Australia is firstly, as we were talking about, it's a bit of a unique financial services economy because of the kind of mandated inflows. But it's also a really long way. And Shannon, I know you've been down to Australia. It's not close to anything.
Right.
Well, it's close to New Zealand, but it's not close to anything important. And so when you think about that, from an Australian perspective, you've really got not a big market, and you've really got to be pretty innovative in how you kind of run businesses and expand and the sort of problems that you need to solve. So there is a bit of a culture of, well, we're just going to lean into it. There's an Australian saying of, she'll be right on the night. And, it's we'll just keep going and we'll keep plowing into it until we work out a way to do it. And that lends itself really well to technology. It lends itself to the fail fast and pivot sort of mentality of startups. And it really drives innovation to think, well, I haven't got a lot and I haven't got a huge market to chase. There's nothing like the venture capital and private equity scale in Australia. So you got to be pretty bootstrapped and pretty lean. And as a result, you tend to get really creative, really fast. And I think for the longest time, a lot of that innovation stayed in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't get out into the world at large, particularly in the fintech space. And it's really only been in maybe the last 10 years that the Australian kind of fintech scene has started to kind of leak out into the rest of the world. And from a Practifi perspective, we were pretty excited to be able to be part of that and to, in a lot of ways, be a front runner to coming to the US, because the more traditional path is to the UK first.
Yep.
Keep it in the Commonwealth, and then try and make your way back. But we had the good fortune of being able to come straight to the US. So it's been an exciting time.
And what propelled that decision? Why was, I mentioned in my intro that, 2017 was really when Practifi made its foray into the US market. So why was that the right time to make that entrance?
I wish there were a really well thought through story here that was like we applied all sorts of great economic models, and we had a great strategy. Truth be told, we were absolutely hell-bent on following the path to the UK. That's what we were going to do. That's where I'd been doing trips to London and assessing the market and product market fit. And a very, very insightful financial services executive here in the US encountered us in Australia, and she tapped me on the shoulder and was like, no, you're aiming a little too far to the right. Let's get you to come and talk to a couple of RIAs in the US. And so December of 2017, we took a trip over here, really with a bit of a lens that it was probably going to be a bit of discovery and didn't really know what to expect. And 2 weeks later, we flew back, having signed our first 2 clients. With all of the best planning in the world, our UK operation still doesn't exist, but we're pretty well established here in the US now.
Well, I can definitely vouch for that. I see Practifi everywhere. And a topic I want to talk to you about is around adoption. We've seen technology adoption among advisors improve, but it's still relatively low. Too often a great product is purchased for its productivity promises, but ultimately disappoints upon delivery because it isn't used, which leads to wasted money, which leads to a lot of angry executives and poor ROI. You need buy-in from the CEO and kind of the top down, and there's obviously lack of training. But in your opinion, what does it take to create adoption around technology?
So I thought this would be a better answer if it didn't come from my opinion. And we happened to have our client advisory board meeting yesterday. So in our client advisory board meeting, we put the question to them and said, what drives adoption? How do you guys feel? Where are you at in adoption with Practifi? And firstly, it felt great because these are some of our most innovative, forward-thinking clients. They're typically managing $8 and up billion. They're big, complex teams, and universally, they were like adoption's 100%. And we're like, okay, how did you get there? What does that look like? What did it take? And really, it is about looking at the barriers to adoption, understanding them. Advisors don't like navigating around a system, clicking in 10 different spots to update pieces of information, because that's what you do when you're taking information from a form and putting it into a system, but it's not what you do in a meeting. It's not a stream of consciousness kind of environment. And we went really hard into automation and data capture and those kind of tools. And those clients have taken what we built and have gone even further to kind of personalize it to their firm and their way of operating. And so they've really got the data capture flow down to a point now where it's actually desirable to put the information in. And I think that's the lesson with any technology is, too often in a technology firm, it's really easy to think about what's optimal from a technology perspective, and you forget about the user experience. And, we think about that lots when we think about client data capture. What tool are we going to put in the hand of the end investor and give them to play with? But we don't think about it as much when we think about the people in the firm. And so if they hate it, they won't use it, and they'll vote with their feet. We see it all the time. People leave firms because the technology is bad.
Oh, absolutely. And we're seeing that, clients aren't leaving their advisors because of portfolio performance per se, but it's really with issues around communication and service, right?
Yeah.
And so, the client experience matters as much as the investment returns, but it certainly feels like the clock is ticking for advisors to adopt digital technology that they need to have a thriving practice, right?
Totally. I mean, client experience is only going to become more prevalent. And, way back at the bottom of that bottle of wine when we were founding the company, that was really one of the key points for us, was to think, where is the industry going over time? We could see consumer technology changing in a vastly different way. And it was about experience and personalization, all those kind of things. And, we roll forward to today and the wealth management is still so far behind. And we think about personalization and we think about giving the end investor a tool, but we don't think about giving the people in the firm the data and the experience they need to deliver that experience.
Right.
Because the experience isn't a piece of technology. That's actually a barrier that we put in place because we haven't solved the personalization problem through the data. We stick, hey, here's a piece of technology to put between the client and the advisor. Instead, it's kind of like outsourcing the experience to the client on a choose your own adventures sort of style.
Absolutely.
On behalf of WealthManagement.com, we invite you to join us on May 13th through 16th in Hollywood, Florida for WealthStack, part of Wealth Management Edge. Our agenda is designed to power a new generation of growth-oriented advisors with the latest innovations and trends in technology strategies. From captivating keynote speakers to interactive workshops, dedicated think tanks, a dynamic exhibit hall, and hands-on demonstrations of cutting-edge technologies, you'll leave with a deep understanding of how to accelerate growth at your practice. Use promo code podcast20 to save 20% off your registration. Visit wealthmanagementedge-event.com for more information.
And another trend I've been following too is really the needs of client households are becoming more and more sophisticated. So how is tech ultimately helping track these kind of increasingly complicated webs of relationships now advisors have to manage?
Yeah, it's amazing. You think about the way a client relationship works with an advice firm. You look at the kind of technology from 10 or 15 years ago when it was, well, just kind of a fancy Rolodex. It was, who do I ring? Well, it's the patriarch or the matriarch, and they're the contact details I have, and that's all I need. Now, of course, you've got everything from what are their investment preferences from a direct indexing perspective through to what does their strategy for wealth transition look like, and who are the people further down the line. And then, of course, as we see household wealth grow, what we see is structural complexity come in. There's trusts and philanthropic exercises and companies and all those sorts of things. And if an advisor can't sit in front of a client and see that whole landscape, then it's incredibly difficult to sit down at a meeting where you're looking at the future of the relationship and justify the fee. It's like, if every time I ask you a question, you have to ask me for details you should already know, then what am I really getting?
Right.
And that's where you see advisors who are nervous and they're looking at, well, we need to give them better investment options. It's like, no, you just need to do a better job of servicing. Think about it. If you went and saw, a family member, and you're like, oh, you've got kids, haven't you? What are their names again? It's like that would go poorly at Thanksgiving. Yet
Yes.
we have people who rock into client relationships where they're managing millions of dollars on behalf of the client, and they don't know the name of the kids or whether they bought or sold a company or what houses they own or where they like to summer or winter, or they just don't have this detail, and they expect the client to say, well, that's great, here's more money.
Right. No,
It's crazy.
It is. And something I've debated too is it really just feels like recently in the US, we've started to put the client at the center of the conversation, which seems a little backwards. And I've talked to other folks in outside markets, UK, Australia, saying, you guys have had it backwards for a little while in the US with that. So we're finally coming around to that way of thinking, of making it all client centric.
Yeah, look, it's been a real journey. I think you asked a question before about the differences between Australia and the US, and I think the compulsory nature of savings in Australia necessarily sticks the client in the middle. It's sort of there. Here, I think for the longest time, so much of it has been about basically being an investment manager on behalf. The outsourced, I'll make the investment decisions, and the structure around more holistic advice. What are your wealth protection needs? What are your retirement plans? What does that look like? That's been very fragmented, and increasingly, while that's more fragmented, the client isn't at the center because the investment return is. That's the service I provide you. Now that's all kind of coming together, either through tech because they're doing some of it themselves, so they don't need an intermediary, or because firms are starting to offer more, it's caused that to coalesce. And as that starts to come together, you start to see more ultra high net worth advice relationships start to feel like multifamily office firms.
Mm-hmm.
You start to see that progression, and you see that family office servicing model start to slide further down in the kind of investable asset pool. And when you start to see that, you start to see more of a fee for service model creep in than an asset-based fee model creep in, because not all the services you provide are linked to assets.
Yes,
And
very
so
much.
you start to see this change happen in the industry, and I think the US is seeing that movement now, from that being just something that's at the most elite level and starting to become a little more democratized.
And even beyond the client experience, technology should really support the rest of the office as much as the advisor. Explain why operations and things like compliance have grown just as complex and vital to a business's health as the delivery of advice.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, we took a decision a long while back to turn Practifi into a role-based application. So if you're a compliance person, you log in, you see a world as though you're a compliance person, weirdly enough. In operations, you see, a very task and process-based world. Advisors see a very client-based world. And importantly, it's the same data set. Like, everyone is still trying to achieve the same outcome in the same business, or should be trying to achieve the same outcome in the same business. But just as the clients have become more complex, so is the operating environment for the firm. The compliance officer in many firms today still, but increasingly, thankfully, they're moving away from it, has had this view of kind of retrospectively looking at a very narrow subset and really hoping that when the SEC comes knocking, they by chance happen to look at that same incredibly narrow subset of client files. Rarely is that the case, weirdly enough. We understand that it's not possible to look at everything all of the time. The firm would grind to a halt, servicing costs would balloon, and it wouldn't work. So what you need is technology that does that for you. You need the system, and this is where Practifi plays a role. You need the system to be looking at every record. Where haven't you updated a record? Where is an orphaned client? Where is there stale data or missing data or those sorts of things, instead of the SEC finding them when they come knocking. So, we like to look at the data and to serve that up to the advisor and give them the chance to make it right, but also let compliance know, because if the stick has to get ahead of the carrot, then sometimes that's how it's got to go.
So the $1 million question is then, is the perfect tech stack possible, or is that still a myth?
Perfect to whom? It's a little bit like, is the perfect date possible? It's kind of all things to all people. So can a firm get a really idealized tech stack for their needs? Absolutely. Would it be perfect to the next firm? Almost certainly not. And I think that's the key. I think too many advisors and too many practice principals are out there saying, well, I went to T3 and they told me that I need these 4 pieces of technology. So I've signed contracts with them now. Now my firm will be magically better. And of course, the answer is it just won't be. There'll be 4 bits of siloed technology that don't talk to each other and don't solve a problem. So I think for firms to get really serious about what their tech stack is, firstly, they've got to actually spin it on their head from what they want to think about. And they want to think, what client experience am I trying to deliver? Because if you start with how do I be more efficient, or how do I lower my cost to serve, or whatever, that's easy, but you'll almost certainly break the client experience that you think you want to deliver. So start with the client experience, work your way back. You can assemble an exceptionally good tech stack. I mean, look at the range of tools that are around for you. The hard part is picking. You know, and I think the only way to do that is to understand where you're trying to get to. If you start with what tool do I pick, how do you know? But if you start with what I'm trying to get to, then you know.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue into our next segment of the episode of Ask Us Anything, where I've gone out to the social universe and asked them to submit questions they want answered by you. So we've had a few folks drop into the DMs this week with the first question actually around CRM. So again, perfect topic here. And the question was, why is there an increasing focus on CRMs? Are they indeed becoming the hub, the power center around which client-centric firms organize their tech stack?
If they're not, they should be. So it feels a little self-serving as an answer, but it happens to also be true. I think, as we talked about, there's always been this battle: is it the portfolio system that's the center, or is it the CRM that's the center? And I think increasingly, as the service proposition or the value proposition from a firm moves away from what's the market return into how do I provide this more holistic value to you, you need a system that's capable of doing that and of nurturing and controlling and driving that process. And that should be the CRM. But of course, it's got to be more than just a straight up simple CRM. It can't just be that Rolodex model. It's got to be able to handle the complexity.
Absolutely. So another $1 million question we have, this is a broad one, but somebody did ask, how do you see fintech evolving in the next 3 to 5 years?
I'll put my Nostradamus pants on. Look, what is certain is it will continue to evolve. I think we'll see things start to coalesce. So what we have at the moment is this. I mean, you look at the various fintech maps that are out there. It is incredibly fragmented, and that's because when you're looking for a problem to solve and you're fighting for that space to solve a problem in, you tend to find a very narrow spot. I think we'll see over the next 3 to 5 years some acquisitions occur and some of those parts start to come together. And of course, as markets are tight, we'll also see those who maybe don't have the financial resilience start to fall out the bottom.
And final question for this segment, where do you see Practifi in 5 to 10 years from now?
Dominating the world. No,
Love it.
Look, I think where we'll be is right where we are now, which is really centered on how do we power that best possible relationship within clients. And we know we do that by making the firm more efficient and effective. We do it by capturing and simplifying all that rich, complex data, and then by orchestrating that integration out to everything else.
Well, Adrian, I appreciate you being put in the hot seat and being put on the spot in your insightful answers. But we've come to our final and my favorite segment of Stack It or Whack It, where I'm going to throw out a few technologies. They're not always WealthTech related, so be warned. And you tell me if they are worth the hype or not. So stack it or whack it. You know, I was going to make a bunch of assumptions about you being Australian and about wine and surfing and beaches, things like that. But, you know, I'll leave you alone. I promise. I was actually going to ask you about Salesforce as another trick question. If you should stack or whack Salesforce.
Whack it.
So I was like, well, maybe not be that harsh, but I would like your thoughts on cloud computing and its impact on wealth management. Stack it or whack it. Have we embraced it? Where are we going?
We are definitely stacking it. If your technology is not in the cloud now, you're a long way behind and you need to hurry up. So cloud computing, absolutely stack it.
All right, stack cloud computing. And number 2, Internet of Things or IoT, which basically describes the vast universe, of embedded sensors connecting consumers and companies through the internet. You forget sometimes that pretty much everything you interact with every day, whether it's smartwatches, cars, refrigerators, all are collecting data on our bodies and how we behave. And we're obviously seeing that in wealth management too. And it's ultimately the fuel that's powering AI. Are we oversaturated when it comes to IoT, or is it a necessary thing to drive better experiences?
I think the answer is yes to both. I think it is necessary to drive better experiences, and there are an incredibly useful array of examples. If you look at health data being fed real time into to insurers, and vehicle usage to property and casualty style insurers, all that kind of stuff is incredibly useful. That your smartphone can turn the lights on and start the coffee machine is really valuable to someone, but maybe not to everyone. So I think that one's a little more nuanced there. I put it in the stack it camp, but I'd have a big caveat over it saying, make sure you know what you want the information for before you start trying to gather it.
That's fair. All right. So stack it with an asterisk. Got it.
Yeah, that's it.
All right, Adrian. Well, I appreciate your time and indulging me on these questions. And it's a pleasure hearing more about Practifi and getting to know you a little better. But feel free to tell listeners where they can find out more about you and what you'll be working on at Practifi.
Absolutely. Look, the website is always the best way, practifi.com. But follow us on LinkedIn and other socials as well. We're always pretty active and super happy to share what's there.
Well, sounds good. And be sure to like and subscribe to all the WealthStack podcasts on all major podcasting platforms, and follow all things WealthStack on wealthmanagement.com, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And thank you all for tuning in today.